Baby. It happened inside a hospital room. Police say 28-year-old Kevin Kanin and 25-year-old Yennefer Tavares Cepeda physically abused the one-day-old infant while in Tower Health Reading Hospital. Officers were called to the hospital on May 2nd as employees found the boy in medical distress inside a private recovery room. An investigation found the child was under the supervision of his parents in the maternity room when the injuries were inflicted and that they did not alert hospital staff. Police took Kanin and Tavares Cepeda into custody yesterday to face charges of criminal homicide.
A newborn baby fought for his life inside a hospital room. Not on a battlefield, not at an accident scene, but inside a maternity ward. A place designed for safety, for new beginnings. A place where life is supposed to start rather than end. Doctors rushed through the corridors of Tower Health Reading Hospital in West Reading, Pennsylvania. Monitors beeped urgently. Nurses moved quickly between rooms. Something was terribly wrong with a newborn who, only hours earlier, had been considered healthy. And inside that same hospital room, investigators would later focus on just two people: the baby's mother and the baby's father. What happened during a short, documented window of time would become the center of a homicide investigation that shocked Pennsylvania and spread across the United States. The baby did not survive, and the timeline of his injuries raised questions that investigators were still working to fully answer. How does a healthy newborn deteriorate inside a hospital recovery room? How does a child die while medical staff are just steps away? What happened behind a closed hospital door that turned a maternity ward into a crime scene? Welcome to Truth Finder of Fees. Today's case is the death of baby boy Tavares Cepeda. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from. May 2nd, 2026, Tower Health Reading Hospital, West Reading, Pennsylvania. Inside a standard maternity unit, a newborn baby entered the world. The mother was 25-year-old Yennefer Tavares Cepeda. The father was 28-year-old Kevin Kanin. According to investigators, there was nothing immediately unusual about the delivery. The baby was born alive and initially appeared stable. There were no emergency alarms, no neonatal crisis, no visible complications reported at birth. The infant was placed into routine post-delivery care, the kind of predictable process familiar in any maternity ward: monitoring, observation, bonding, and recovery. Both parents were present in the private recovery room, and hospital staff began standard postpartum protocols, including periodic checks, vital monitoring, and routine observation. On paper, everything appeared normal. But in cases like this, investigators often focus not on what is immediately visible, but on what happens between observations. Hospitals do not monitor continuously inside private rooms. Staff enter, observe, and leave. And between those intervals, time becomes a critical investigative factor. That is exactly what would later define this case. According to official investigative summaries, the baby remained in the room with both parents between scheduled wellness checks. That detail, simple, procedural, seemingly routine, would later become the foundation of a homicide timeline reconstruction. Because within that window of time, something changed. Later that same day, hospital staff entered the recovery room and found the newborn in medical distress. Authorities have been careful in their public statements, but what is confirmed is this: a baby who had been considered stable after birth was now in serious and sudden medical distress, severe enough to trigger emergency response procedures inside the hospital. Medical staff responded immediately, attempting stabilization while preparing to escalate care. West Reading police were contacted after hospital personnel raised concerns about possible child abuse. That notification marked a critical threshold, because once law enforcement enters a maternity ward in response to suspected abuse of a newborn, the situation is no longer purely medical. It becomes forensic. Investigators began documenting everything: timelines, staff movement, room access logs, and observation records. One thing quickly became clear: who was in the room during the critical window. Hospital documentation began to narrow the timeline between wellness checks, and according to investigators, only the parents were present during the period when the baby's condition changed dramatically. Doctors determined the infant required advanced care beyond the facility's capabilities and ordered an emergency transfer. The newborn was transported from Tower Health Reading Hospital to Penn State Health Milton S. Hershey Medical Center in Hershey, Pennsylvania, not as a routine transfer, but as an urgent neonatal emergency. Medical teams at Hershey received the child and immediately began intensive intervention, while criminal investigation ran in parallel. Doctors began documenting injuries. Law enforcement began securing timelines. Hospital records became evidence. Medical personnel at Hershey later reported that the injuries observed were not consistent with birth-related complications. That distinction became legally significant because if the injuries were not consistent with childbirth, it introduced the possibility of external trauma into the investigation. May 3, 2026, less than 24 hours after birth. Despite all medical intervention, the newborn died at Penn State Health Milton S. Hershey Medical Center. He was later identified in official documents as baby boy Tavares Cepeda. With his death, the case transitioned fully into a homicide investigation. The focus was no longer survival, it was the determination of cause and responsibility. Medical personnel indicated that the injuries appeared consistent with physical trauma rather than natural complications, and authorities began preparing for a forensic autopsy. The death of a newborn inside a hospital does not simply end with a medical declaration. It triggers something far more complex. By the time baby boy Tavares Cepeda was pronounced dead, the investigation was already running on two parallel tracks. One medical, focused on understanding what happened to the child, and one legal, focused on determining whether what happened was criminal. In cases involving infants, those two tracks rarely stay separate for long, because newborn injuries require one critical distinction. Was the trauma consistent with childbirth, or did it occur afterward? That question would become central to everything that followed. May 5, 2026, they did autopsy. The infant's body was transferred to the Dauphin County Forensic Center for autopsy, where medical examination becomes legal evidence. A forensic autopsy in a case like this is designed to answer three core questions. What caused the death? When did the fatal injuries occur? And do the injuries suggest external force? The publicly reported conclusion was that the infant died from multiple traumatic injuries, and the manner of death was ruled homicide. That ruling is one of the most significant legal thresholds in any death investigation. In forensic terms, homicide does not automatically determine intent. It means the death resulted from injuries inflicted by another person. The exact mechanism of those injuries has not been publicly detailed, which is common in active criminal cases where investigators withhold precise medical descriptions to preserve evidentiary integrity during prosecution. There has been no verified public disclosure of exact internal injury mapping, specific anatomical findings, or detailed mechanism explanation. Once the autopsy established homicide as the manner of death, investigators turned their attention to the hospital timeline. Hospitals operate on structured documentation systems, nurse check-ins, vital sign recordings, room entry logs, and monitoring schedules, and each of these creates a time-stamped record. In this case, those records were essential. Investigators reconstructed a timeline based on documented wellness checks inside the maternity ward and identified a narrow window between observations, a gap during which the infant's condition changed significantly. Inside that window, investigators allege, only two individuals had access to the infant in the private recovery room: Kanin and Yennefer Tavares Cepeda. It is important to note, however, that access does not equal action, and presence does not equal causation. Timeline narrowing focuses investigative attention, but it does not constitute proof of what occurred. 17 days after the birth of the baby inside that West Reading Hospital, the case reached its most decisive legal turning point. Inside the Berks County District Attorney's office, prosecutors were ready to speak publicly. District Attorney John T. Adams formally announced criminal charges against both Kanin, 28, and Yennefer Tavares Cepeda, 25, in connection with the death of their newborn son. The charges were severe: criminal homicide, aggravated assault, and endangering the welfare of a child. In his public statement, DA Adams outlined the core structure of the case. The infant was born at Tower Health Reading Hospital, initially reported as healthy, and placed in a private recovery room with both parents. Hospital staff conducted periodic wellness checks, and during a narrow, documented time frame between those checks, the infant's condition changed dramatically. Prosecutors described that period as critical, the window in which they believe the fatal injuries occurred. Medical findings suggesting the injuries were not consistent with childbirth complications supported the argument that trauma occurred after delivery. DA Adams described the case as one of the most disturbing investigations his office had handled involving a newborn child. His statement was measured but firm. He did not speculate beyond the evidence. Instead, he framed the case around three elements: the newborn's death, the hospital setting, and the narrow timeline between wellness checks. He was also careful to emphasize that charges represent allegations, not convictions. Following the announcement of charges, Kevin Kanin and Yennefer Tavares Cepeda were taken into custody in Reading, Pennsylvania, and transported to the Berks County Sheriff's Central Processing Center for standard booking procedures. Both individuals remained in custody pending initial court proceedings, with reports indicating bail was denied given the severity of the charges. Once charges were announced, the case spread rapidly across national media. The combination of factors made it particularly striking to the public. A newborn infant, a maternity ward setting, both parents charged, and a timeline between birth and death measured in less than 24 hours. News outlets, television coverage, and digital platforms picked up the story quickly, though most reporting relied heavily on the official DA announcement, since authorities had not released additional forensic detail. What made the case especially unsettling was not only what allegedly happened, but where it allegedly happened. A hospital room is one of the most controlled environments in modern society, with scheduled nurse checks, continuous monitoring protocols, restricted access areas, and detailed medical documentation. Yet despite all of that structure, a newborn died under circumstances now treated as homicide. People struggled to reconcile the idea of medical supervision with the possibility of undetected fatal injury. Investigators, however, did not publicly claim any failure of the hospital system itself. Their focus remained on that narrow time frame inside a private room, and criminal responsibility and institutional failure are not the same category of conclusion. What remains unanswered? As of the last verified reporting in May 2026, most of the investigative file remains out of public view. Only select elements have been released through district attorney statements, arrest announcements, and limited media summaries. What remains undisclosed includes detailed autopsy documentation beyond cause classification, full investigative interview records, internal hospital logs, forensic imaging, and any defense narrative presented in evidentiary form. This is not unusual in active homicide prosecutions, particularly those involving minors, where courts and prosecutors restrict disclosure to protect trial fairness, evidentiary integrity, and witness reliability. Legally, the presumption of innocence remains intact for both defendants. No conviction has occurred. No trial verdict has been reached. The prosecution must still prove its case in court to the standard of beyond reasonable doubt, establishing causation, timing, and criminal responsibility, none of which has been judicially decided. Investigators have narrowed the time frame. They have established when the infant's condition changed and classified the manner of death as homicide. But the precise sequence of events inside that recovery room has not been publicly detailed in a complete, verified narrative. Cases like this remain open for a long time because they require the convergence of multiple disciplines: forensic pathology, neonatal medicine, criminal investigation, prosecution standards, and courtroom admissibility rules. Each layer must align before a final legal conclusion is reached. A newborn baby entered the world inside a hospital in West Reading, Pennsylvania. Within hours, he was in medical distress. Within a day, he was gone. And weeks later, 2 parents were charged with homicide. But between those confirmed facts lies a gap, one filled with medical records, forensic interpretation, and legal allegations still waiting to be tested in court. A charge is not an ending. It is the beginning of proof. And until that proof is examined in a full public trial, the final truth of what happened inside that maternity room remains unresolved. This is Truth Finder Afees, and this was the case of baby boy Tavares Cepeda.
The case may be closed, but the story never forgotten. Thank you for watching Truth Finder.